World War II, Consequences of World War I? From World War II Diaries. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919 at the Palace of Versailles in Paris at the end of World War I, codified peace terms between the victorious Allies and Germany. The Treaty of Versailles held Germany responsible for starting the war and imposed harsh penalties in terms of loss of territory, massive reparations payments and demilitarization. Far from the peace without victory that U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had outlined in his famous 14 points in early 1918, the Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany while failing to resolve the underlying issues that had led to war in the first place. Economic distress and resentment of the treaty within Germany helped fuel the ultranationalist sentiment that led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party, as well as the coming of a World War II just 2 decades later. During the 1920s, attempts were made to achieve a stable peace. The first was the establishment of the League of Nations as a forum in which nations could settle their disputes. The League's powers were limited to persuasion and various levels of moral and economic sanctions that the members were free to carry out as they saw fit. At the Washington Conference of 1921, the principal naval powers agreed to limit their navies according to a fixed ratio. The Locarno Conference of 1925 produced a treaty guarantee of the German-French boundary and an arbitration agreement between Germany and Poland. In the Kellogg-Brianda Pact of 1928, 63 countries, including all the great powers except the USSR, renounced war as an instrument of national policy and pledged to resolve all disputes among them by pacific means. The signatories had agreed beforehand to exempt wars of self-defense. The costs of carrying out World War I, as well as the costs to rebuild Western Europe after years of fighting, resulted in enormous debts on the part of the Western European powers to the United States. The enormous reparations put on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles also increased the debts. Coupled with ineffective governments in many of these European states, led to slow reconstruction and poor economic growth. With the crash of the New York stock market on October 29, 1929, the United States recalled all foreign loans in the following days. Unable to repay these loans, the economies of the West collapsed, beginning the Great Depression. One of the victors' stated aims in World War I had been to make the world safe for democracy, and post-war Germany adopted a democratic constitution, as did most of the other states restored or created after the war. In the 1920s, however, the wave of the future appeared to be a form of nationalistic, militaristic totalitarianism known by its Italian name, fascism. It promised to minister to people's wants more effectively than democracy and presented itself as the one sure defense against communism. Benito Mussolini established the first fascist, European dictatorship during the interwar period in Italy in 1922. The treaty compelled Germany to turn over its coal mines to France, under control of the League of Nations. The treaty took the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which Germany had seized during the 1871, and gave it back to France. The treaty forced the Germans to dismantle their fortifications. It ordered Germany to respect the independence of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Prussia, and Poland, compelled Germany to renounce territorial claims. The treaty stripped Germany of its colonies in China and Africa. The treaty reduced the size of the German army, which had reached 1.9 million troops during World War I, to just 100,000. It disarmed the German military, limiting the number of weapons and even how much ammunition it could possess. Germany could only manufacture new war material in a few factories approved by the Allies. The Germans had to turn over vast amounts of equipment, from tanks to machine guns to telephones. The treaty reduced Germany's naval forces to a skeleton force that included just 6 battleships, 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 12 torpedo boats, and totally eliminated the submarine fleet that had terrorized ships in the Atlantic. The treaty prohibited Germany from having an air force, except for up to 100 seaplanes to work in minesweeping operations. The treaty authorized the Allies to conduct war crimes trials. It required Germany to accept responsibility for causing all the loss and damage inflicted on the Allies. That provision became the basis for the Allies for demand that Germany pay reparations, which were set by a series of conferences in 1920 at $33 billion, equaling about $423 billion in 2019. Germany was already in deep financial trouble, due to the former imperial regime's trick of printing a lot of currency and borrowing heavily to cover its military expenditures. The new German government, struggling under the weight of debt and budget deficits, defaulted on the payments in gold-backed marks that it was obligated to make. Adolf Hitler, the leader of the German National Socialist, Nazi, Party, preached a racist brand of fascism. Hitler promised to overturn the Versailles Treaty and secure additional and better living space for the German people, who he contended deserve more as members of a superior race. In the early 1930s, the Great Depression hit Germany. The moderate parties could not agree on what to do about it, and large numbers of voters turned to the Nazis and Communists. In 1933 Hitler became the German Chancellor, and in a series of subsequent moves established himself as dictator. Meanwhile, Germany was already violating the treaty's disarmament provisions, and in 1935, Adolf Hitler denounced the treaty altogether. His party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazis, defied the treaty by building up Germany's armed forces to 1.5 million men. Japan did not formally adopt fascism, but the armed forces' powerful position in government enabled them to impose a similar type of totalitarianism. By 1931, the Depression had struck a blow to Japan. The government did little to help Japan's economy, and in the eyes of its citizens, was weak and powerless. Instead, the public favored the Japanese army, and soon the civilian government had lost control of its military. To the army, Manchuria seemed like an obvious solution to many of Japan's problems. As dismantlers of the world status quo, the Japanese were well ahead of Hitler. They used a minor clash with Chinese troops near Mukden, also known as the Mukden or Manchurian Crisis, in 1931 as a pretext for taking over all of Manchuria, where they proclaimed the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932. In 1937–38 they occupied the main Chinese ports. Having denounced the disarmament clauses of the Versailles Treaty, created a new air force, and reintroduced conscription. Hitler tried out his new weapons on the side of right-wing military rebels in the Spanish Civil War of 1936–1939. This venture brought him into collaboration with Mussolini, who was also supporting the Spanish revolt after having seized Ethiopia in a small war. Treaties between Germany, Italy, and Japan in 1936–37 brought into being the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. For example, Japan and Germany signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936 and then Italy joined in 1937. This pact denounced communism and it showed their unity in the matter. The Axis thereafter became the collective term for those countries and their allies. Negotiated in Paris in early 1919, the treaty was practically dictated by the Allied powers with almost no input from the Germans. As a result, Germany was stripped of all her colonies and its armed forces were drastically reduced. There was an identified risk amongst the parties involved in the treaty that Germany would react badly if it were punished following the war. The German government signed the treaty under protest and many attacked it as a betrayal. Several politicians who were considered responsible for this betrayal were assassinated by terrorist groups. It continues to be debated whether the treaty was a catalyst for the Second World War. Some historians believe that the negotiators did the best job they could, given the difficult circumstances they were in. Other historians believe the treaty was a disastrous half-measure. It damaged Germany enough to cause resentment while leaving it strong enough to seek revenge. What is clear is that the burden of war guilt that was placed on Germany by the Allied powers and the harsh conditions placed on them helped to create an unstable Europe, and the treaty failed to resolve the underlying issues that caused World War I to break out in 1914. Thanks for watching, friends, and see you in the next video.